Hi guys, I'm back. A lot of people have been requesting a video on the judging axes for a year now, so here it is. I kind of had anxiety writing this video. I guess FI is so intrinsic to how I experience life that it was difficult for me to know for sure if I'm totally accurate about the opposite judging axis. I'm much more confident identifying these functions in people, just because I've seen so many examples, rather than explain it in purely conceptual terms. So this video will have more examples and details than most of my other voiceover videos. Also, I think because of the Myers-Briggs binary, that people are either thinkers or feelers rather than the reality that we're all both, they had to soften the label feelings to values. Here we see the definition of value as relative worth, merit, or importance, but that's something that can be derived via reason and feelings. The example here is interestingly the value of a college education. While a college degree likely opens up opportunities, that's reason. I want to go to college, that's feeling. How about the golden example of MBTI, harmony, as a value? Well, if people are harmonious, it'll probably be easier to achieve things. Reason: it feels good to be in a harmonious atmosphere. Feeling: just to be clear, I'm definitely not saying that typing based on values is wrong, but it's really hard to type people by scrutinizing whether their values exist or labeling certain values as personal and other values as collective. To me, it actually becomes a bit easier and more straightforward when we take the word feeling at face value, and this is something I wanted to share today. Okay, starting with the FITE axis. Ever notice how introverted feelers often don't like what they perceive to be an attempt at interfering with their emotions? They're generally awkward when people try to cheer them up or bring them down. They don't really feel at home in events that are for the primary purpose of collective feeling, for example, a funeral or a boisterous party. Their feelings are often not in sync with their environment and often unaffected by the environment. They can be at the most joyous gathering, but be distracted by some dark mood within. They often miss jokes that many others are partaking in, but then laugh spontaneously to themselves when they remember something funny and fail to share that with others. Sometimes when they talk to people, they completely misjudge the external emotional tone at the present moment and end up almost as if they're talking to themselves, their words moving no one and gathering the attention of no one. If a friend is feeling down, the FI user might utter some words of comfort but have little sympathetic emotional display. They might well be feeling a great deal towards their friend, but it doesn't get translated out into the external world in a proper or expected way, though the depth of feeling inside is there. If you ask an introverted feeler how they feel, they can usually explain it quite well, though dryly. Feelings get retained internally and overlap on top of each other. Because the feelings are retained, the FI user can distinguish between the finer shades of different feelings. It's a very rich feeling palette, if you will. They'll remember how certain objects and situations made them feel and probably figure out why through the recurrences of similar feelings. In a way, feelings are conceptualized, in that a feeling can be imagined as an entity even during its external absence or absence of external effect. I think this is why FI became associated with authenticity. They know very well what they like and dislike simply through retaining their feelings. They also know what generally feels good or right to do and what doesn't, such that some semblance of a consistent internal structure is created from which they know whether or not an action is congruent with their character or not. The FI user is not necessarily self-centered, but always self-centric. They understand other people's emotions through their own by putting themselves in the other's shoes. They don't experience others' emotions, nor the communal emotional atmosphere directly. I think this is actually why some say that FI users make good therapists. I think FI has to translate the other's emotions to themselves, and this translation process can be helpful to the other person, who might not fully understand their own emotions in the first place. They also tend to be very insular with their emotions, not trying to inject or take away any of the other person's emotions. So basically, the other person has to deal with all of their emotions themselves. As an introverted judging function, FI essentially structures oneself. It knows how it feels about various things and also knows how it wants to feel about various things. I think this is why FI is also associated with idealism. Ideal feeling states are thought of and part of the internal structure that's so key to the FI user's identity. All FI users have TE as an accompaniment. TE is an extroverted judging function, so instead of structuring oneself, it's structuring the world, the external environment, and it's doing so with reason. If you observe TE users, they're often disseminating information, which can be annoying to some people, but that's how they interact with the world. Logic and reason are their tools, and they assume that the use of reason is universal. I think this is why TE is so associated with optimization, because they're trying to structure the external environment in a way that makes more sense. So they're constantly making tweaks so that things run faster or smoother. This is also why TE is associated with facts, but it's more like empirical evidence, because contrary to popular belief, TE users don't just automatically accept all facts. If a TE user lived in a society where all textbooks said that the sky was pink, it doesn't mean they'll just believe it. This is because they would still see that the sky was blue and take that external evidence into account. And this is not to mention the interplay with their other cognitive processes. So even though T itself doesn't retain anything, your perceiving processes, either SI or NI, plus universal biological memory, does retain information that gets recalled in relevant scenarios. So yes, a TE user who's working on a complex math problem will recall how to do basic math. But just to be clear, you don't only use TE when doing math or another stereotypically logical endeavor. Whoever has TE, even if they're an INFP, will have TE evaluations about everything. For example, picking a job. The TE evaluation might be that a certain job tends to make more money, while the FI evaluation might be that they like a certain job. However, there's a lot of gray area. For example, TE can take into account that liking a job is better for mental health, and having good mental health is likely to save money in the long run. And FI might take into account that having more money will make them feel better or that they like being high status. So once again, it's really hard to just type people based on what they value or what they end up doing. But pay attention when someone primarily communicates via information. Perhaps they spontaneously give you advice on how to do something you're doing faster. Perhaps they dryly say what needs to be said without any attention to the emotional atmosphere or their emotional effect on others. Do they structure their home or work environment? Not necessarily neatly, but functionally so that it makes things easier for themselves? Do they have leaking emotions or emotions that seem to sprout up suddenly from nowhere and go away just as suddenly? Everyone on the FI-TE axis are going to have these signs, with the high FI users being more heavy on the ideal emotional states and realization of all their deeply nuanced personal preferences and a high amount of randomly leaking emotions that probably seem quite quirky, and feeling quite vividly what they want, whereas the high TE users are going to be more heavy on the external optimization, focusing on external evidence, focusing on what works, perhaps knowing more generally what feels wrong and right, but not having a whole array of emotions to guide them. The IXTJs and EXFPs who have FI and TE in the middle are going to be fairly balanced in this respect, able to decipher personal desires while simultaneously accounting for facts and feasibility. With dominant TE users, you find that they sometimes go very effectively up the ladder, if you will, only to realize later that it's the wrong ladder or that they didn't want to go in that direction after all. Whereas with dominant FI users, they usually know full well which ladder they'd like to be on, but have trouble with the part about effectively impacting the external environment to achieve their goals. Alright, moving on to the TIFE axis. TI users are famed for the deep ways in which they understand things. Reason is not just a tool to use to achieve some purpose, nor does it only exist when its effects can be observed and measured. For TI, logic and rationality are internalized, And just as insular as Fi, that means the reasons can be divorced from external manifestations and consequences. I think this is why TI is often associated with logical abstractions. Indeed, they often analyze logical principles as entities separate from the external world, similar to how FI users analyze their emotions. TI is also associated with closed logical systems. I think this is simply because lines of reasoning are retained and structured in the internal environment. Thus, there's a space for interesting lines of reasoning that don't necessarily affect the external world or lack real world application. Instead of being motivated by emotion, the TI user is motivated by reason. But unlike the reason of the TE user, it's not an active form of reason that achieves external outcomes and structures the external environment. It's a self contained logical structure that strives to simultaneously account for the complexities of the world as well as reduce it to the simplest principles and axioms to capture some kind of truth. TI users essentially seek to understand the core of everything so that they can act in a way that makes the most sense to them. Also, just as emotions in and of themselves are just interesting to the FI user, I think information is just interesting to the TI user in and of itself, in that it adds to their internal structure of how the world works. As an introverted judging function, TI structures oneself and not the world. So instead of acting upon the world using reason as a tool, reason makes up the fabric of the TI user's identity. Except I've been told that TI users probably don't think of the word as identity, perhaps more like worldview or understanding. Anyway, it's an internal structure that remains fairly consistent over time, over an individual's life, similar to FI. FI and TI, of course, both changed, but it's more like a building changing its scaffolding or undergoing an entire renovation where you can trace its change over time. Whereas for TE and FE, it's more like water, adapting rapidly to the present external circumstance and remaining fairly shapeless. Also, once again, TI is not just applicable to random logical puzzles. Anyone with TI, even if you're a ESFJ, are gonna have TI evaluations pop up everywhere, even with socializing. Actually, I think IXTPs are famous for making logical systems in their minds about how to socialize, which is why they can sometimes come off a bit robotic in social interactions. Also, TI can account for social systems, as I've learned from my INTP father, who has internalized our modern corporate work culture in a very TI manner, with his own reasons explaining why things are the way they are. Its natural complement is extroverted feeling, which is an extroverted judging function. Like TE, FE also structures the world, the external environment, but it's doing so with emotion. If you observe high FE users, you'll notice that they're often quite demonstrative. Usually, you don't have to guess at what they're feeling. They'll usually make it known, maybe not through words, but through their vibe. That's simply because for extroverted feeling, feelings have to be extroverted. Just as TE demands an external application of logic, for FE, emotional expressiveness and lack thereof cannot be divorced from their real world consequences. Emotions are to be made known to the other person. Though I guess emotions might be largely hormonal and neurochemical, so FE users probably experience just as strong emotions, though they don't get retained. Perhaps they get retained as a memory, but not in a way that completely reforms their internal structure and affects their entire worldview. That wouldn't be very logical to TI. Something I noticed though is that while FE users don't sit around thinking about their emotions all day, they're actually very directly sensitive to others' emotions, or the communal emotional atmosphere. A wounded expression or a shift in this atmosphere is noticed immediately and felt poignantly. I think this is why FE is so often lumped together with harmony, because disharmony or negative emotions in others affect the FE user directly. This is why FJs are so often actively building a lively, positive atmosphere. If you talk to an IXFJ about your negative emotions, their first instinct might be to understand via SI or NI, but if you talk to an EXFJ, most likely their first instinct would be to change it to something positive. Perhaps they'll tell a joke or give you some actionable advice. The interesting thing is, having FE period seems enough to be directly sensitive to and affected by the emotions of others. I can tell when my mom is upset, my dad, the INTP, looks incredibly uncomfortable. I also have an INTP friend who said that she can just start watching a horror movie in the middle, have no idea what's going on plot-wise, but feel scared because she's seeing that the characters are scared, and that emotion kinda transfers over. However, while high FE is usually adept at actively changing the emotional atmosphere, actively affecting the external world, lower FE isn't so much. Just like how lower TE tends to not be great at structuring their external environment in a logical, functional manner. Okay, so to contrast with FI, I'm not just some sociopath who's never affected when others are upset, but I don't get affected directly. I have to understand why they're upset through TE. What happened? Notes that often I don't know what happened, but my mind guesses or makes up what happened. Then I pinpoint a distilled emotion from within that I already know well. So it's this roundabout process, which can be quick and can be automatic, but it's not direct. FE users seem to transfer emotions first, then information or content, whereas for TE, it's vice versa. And you can see this down to their vocal tone, which is definitely a topic for another video. If you look at speeches by FJs, they're making some TI arguments within it, but the primary aim, or at least the most visible aim to me, is that they're stirring people's emotions. They're structuring the external world in a way to get people on their side. Even INTPs, who are primarily sharing their TI, requires a welcoming, inclusive, or at least civil atmosphere, otherwise they might just slink away. And INFPs, okay, so you often hear them talking about the humanities or relationships, all quote-unquote feeler fields, but despite their leaking emotions, they're not actually sharing nor transferring the emotions. They're sharing information. They want to know the who, what, whys of your experience, then deepen their own internal, insular understanding of emotions within themselves, not partake in your emotional experience. Okay, that is all I have for now. The easiest way for me to tell between these two axes when typing people is the vocal tone. Internal versus external feelings make a world of difference there. And along those lines, the leaking emotions that I mentioned versus more steady or intentional emotive display. I still do the smile types, which helps, but some people's genetic structure makes the movement type a little ambiguous, so tracing people's emotional displays helps a lot. But I'm getting very ahead of myself there, so if you want to be typed by me, it's on the website. Also, a big thank you to my patrons for supporting this channel. Thanks so much for watching. Until next time.